And having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
Now, Mr. President, Mr. President, the Senate gavels in this morning for a joyous, momentous, groundbreaking day. This morning we will vote to end debate on the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to be a justice on the United States Supreme Court. And later this afternoon, the Senate will fulfill its constitutional duty to finally confirm this remarkable and groundbreaking jurist. The cloture vote is scheduled to take place at approximately 11 a.m., and we will aim to vote on final confirmation in the afternoon, the time depending on how many members wish to speak. Today is a culmination for one of 6 weeks where this chamber has examined and debated and questioned Judge Jackson on her record and her qualifications. Every step of the way, the judge has proved herself exceptionally qualified and thoughtful and prepared to serve on the court. As I have said, she encapsulates the 3 Bs: brilliant, beloved, and belongs. She belongs on the Supreme Court. It's now up to us to finish the work that the President entrusted us to do. So today is also a joyous celebration in another way. In the 233-year history of the Supreme Court, never has a black woman held the title of justice. Ketanji Brown Jackson will be the first, and I believe the first of more to come. This milestone should have happened generations ago, but we are always trotting on a path towards a more perfect union. Nevertheless, America today is taking a giant step towards making our union more perfect. People sometimes talk about standing on the shoulder of giants. Well, Judge Jackson will go down in history as an American giant upon whose shoulders others will stand tall, and our democracy will be better off for it. I'll have more to say later this afternoon prior to the final vote on the confirmation. But for now, I want to thank Chairman Durbin of the Senate Judiciary Committee for beautifully executing the nomination, all the members of the Judiciary Committee for their thoughtful and respectful, all of my Democratic colleagues on the Judiciary Committee for their thoughtful and insightful examination of the judge's record, and I want to thank those Republican senators who chose to take this process seriously. So, it's truly a joyous day. Joyous for the Senate, joyous for the court, joyous for America. Let us finish the work today of confirming Judge Jackson finally to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, on the final day of the work period, the Senate is going to pass a much-needed, a much-sought-after piece of legislation, revoking Russia a permanent normal trade relation with the United States. The legislation will go a long way to landing a painful, severe blow on Putin's economy. It will hinder his ability to keep funding his war machine and adds Russia as well as Belarus to a list of nations, including North Korea, that are ineligible for free trade with the United States. I want to thank my colleague from Idaho, Senator Crapo, for working so closely with me on into the night last night to make sure that this got done. We will also vote separately on legislation regarding an oil ban, and I thank my colleagues who worked together to reach a compromise on this measure. We are moving forward today. Putin must absolutely be held accountable for the detestable and despicable war crimes he is committing against Ukraine. The images we have seen coming out of that country, most recently out of the town of Bucha, are pure evil. Hundreds of civilians murdered in cold blood. Dozens of bodies of men, women, children, the elderly, the defenseless, people with hands tied behind their backs and left dead in the streets. Some of the bodies showed signs of torture. According to a new report by Der Spiegel, German intelligence now believes that some of these murders were discussed by Russian troops over radio intercepts. And why were these people killed? Simply because they were Ukrainians. So many were children, civilians, young people, women. No nation whose military is committing war crimes deserves free trade status with the United States. Let me say that again. No nation whose military is committing war crimes deserves free trade status with the United States. No vile thug like Putin deserves to stand as an equal with the leaders of the free world. He is a menace and a pariah who has ensured that his place in history will be one of everlasting shame. So today's votes approving PNTR revocation are significant. It is very important that the Senate pass this bill. And I said I want to thank Senator Crapo, as well as Senators Manchin and Cardin and Wyden and Murkowski and Menendez, and all others who worked in good faith with us together on these measures. We wouldn't have reached this outcome without their diligence and good faith. Finally, I want to close with a few thoughts on what the Senate has accomplished over the past 6 weeks. There are two words that I believe perfectly summarize the work period we're about to conclude: productive, bipartisan. In this work period alone, we passed a major postal reform bill over a decade in the making. We passed a bold and robust government funding package, which will help millions of Americans in thousands of different ways. We passed critical emergency aid for the people of Ukraine. We passed the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill after a century of waiting. And topping it all off, we will confirm the 116th Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Meanwhile, before I yield, I also want to applaud the administration's action in extending the pause on payments and interest to federal student loans. The pandemic continues to impact families economically, and that is why extension is critical for so many borrowers. And while the extension provides relief, I continue to urge the President to use his existing authority and cancel up to $50,000 in debt in order to provide immediate relief to millions of borrowers, boost our economic recovery, and help narrow the racial wealth gap in our country. So it's been a very busy April. It's been a very busy March and work period. And when we come back in May, it's going to be very busy again. We have a whole lot to do. I yield the floor. I yield.
The morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Supreme Court of the United States. Ketanji Brown Jackson of the District of Columbia to be an Associate Justice.
We got to vote at 10.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
I'm going to be very brief, and I want to echo what the Majority Leader said, particularly with respect to revoking permanent normal trade relations with Russia. And the Senate and those who are following this should understand that in just a few minutes, the Senate is going to take another crucial step in bringing every tool of economic pressure to bear on Vladimir Putin and his oligarch allies. And ending normal trade relations hammers home that Putin has made Russia into a full-fledged pariah state. As the leader noted, Americans have been watching these atrocities, these brutal acts perpetrated by Vladimir Putin day after day on TVs, on their phones, and the like. And now the Senate is saying there is going to be clear evidence that what he has done has forfeited the right to normal trade relations. And I'll just wrap up by way of saying that when we get done on the Senate Finance Committee, we're going to continue to work in a bipartisan way to send Putin additional messages that are going to rein in his economic power. In particular, I think it's high time to take away the subsidies he gets from American taxpayers for his war machine. That happens when you have an American company doing business in Russia. They pay taxes to the Russian government, and they get foreign tax credits. I don't believe the people of Michigan or Oregon or anywhere else believe that their tax dollars or hard-earned tax dollars should be used to subsidize Putin's war machine. So this is a very important step today to making sure, as I indicated, we're putting in place every single economic tool to hammer Putin and his oligarchs. I urge my colleagues, as Senator Schumer has just done, to vote yes. And I also want to thank the ranking minority member of the Finance Committee. I talked to him a few minutes ago. He continues to do everything he can at every step of the way to make this a bipartisan effort. That's the message we ought to send. I yield the floor and urge colleagues to vote yes when we take away normal trade relations with Russia here in a few minutes. And I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Waldman.
The Republican leader.
Further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Here's a quote from candidate Biden's campaign website in 2020. Quote, "The U.S. has a right and a duty to secure our borders and protect our people against threats." End quote. Well, that was then. This is now. The Biden administration's weak border policies set a new record in 2021. Customs and Border Protection had to make, listen to this, 2 million arrests. And it doesn't appear that that new record will last long. 2022 is already trending even worse. CBP is currently seeing about 7,000 encounters every single day, and they fear they could see as many as 18,000 per day, a truly staggering figure. To put this in perspective, President Obama's former DHS Secretary Jay Johnson has reflected that a daily count above 1,000 was, quote, a relatively bad number, and I was going to be in a bad mood the whole day, reflecting back on his experience. Now we're at 7 times that figure and still climbing. It's the President's responsibility to fix this crisis. But this President is taking major steps to make it even worse. The Biden administration has announced they will cancel legal authorities that have helped CBP contend with these massive surges. A group of states led by Arizona have explained in court that Title 42 is, quote, the only safety valve preventing this administration's disastrous border policies from devolving into an unmitigated catastrophe. The administration's attempts to explain why they're caving to the far left and throwing our borders open make no sense whatsoever. The White House keeps claiming this is a public health decision. They cannot keep Title 42, leading you to ask, why? Democrats don't act like they think COVID is finished. They give speeches daily about the need for more funding. They say we should be sending health assistance around the rest of the world. The only place on the planet where Democrats say COVID is over, apparently, is at our southern border. A growing number of House and Senate Democrats have expressed concern and anger over President Biden's awful decision. But press releases are one thing. What matters is how people vote. Senate Democrats have taken every meaningful opportunity to back the administration's border policies and vote down Republican efforts to improve security. Their votes have helped create this mess. We'll see if they finally change course and begin voting to help Republicans end the crisis instead. Now, on another matter, last week President Biden released his budget request for next year. The President got to take a blank canvas and sketch his policy vision for the country. But in the critical area of defending our nation, the President's vision came up way, way short. Even amidst a hot war in Europe, bipartisan recognition of threats from China, North Korea, nuclear and missile proliferation, and Iran's nuclear, missile, and terrorism trifecta, President Biden proposes to underfund our armed forces. Even if Democrats manage to magically get their runaway inflation under control faster than anyone predicts, their proposal would only flat fund defense. While China keeps ramping their military spending way up, the Biden budget would have America treading water at best. More likely, if Democrats' high inflation sticks around, the President's proposal would actually cut the military's purchasing power. As we speak, Secretary Austin, General Milley, DOD Comptroller Michael McCord are testifying before the Armed Services Committee to provide some answers about their boss's baffling budget request. These senior leaders have a responsibility to be strong advocates within the administration for the resources that our service members actually need. When the far left wanted President Obama to slash military spending, Secretary Leon Panetta waged an impassioned public and private campaign to stick up for our national defense. But if Secretary Austin is advocating for the military's bottom line, he's not doing it very effectively. The administration's proposed defense increase of 4% before inflation doesn't come anywhere near meeting our military's requirements to compete with China and preserve peace well into the future. Yet the same budget lavishes a gigantic 14% increase on domestic discretionary spending. If our colleague Chairman Sanders wrote a budget and gave the Pentagon zero input or influence, it might not look much different than the administration's actual product. So, Madam President, the world is a dangerous place. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other adversaries remind us of this basic fact every single day. Our Commander-in-Chief needs to get with the program. Now, on one final matter, the last few weeks have confirmed a pattern that has played out repeatedly in recent decades. When Republican presidents make Supreme Court nominations, the far left and the media melt down. Absurd allegations, conspiracy theories, cheap gimmicks, and apocalyptic rhetoric are all guaranteed. But when Democratic presidents make nominations, Senate Republicans inquire about past rulings and judicial philosophy, and the country gets the serious process it deserves. On Tuesday, I explained how 30 years of escalation by Democrats ushered in this assertive period for the Senate regarding judicial nominations. Now and for the foreseeable future, the Senate views itself as a co-partner in the process. On Wednesday, I walked through Judge Jackson's long and disturbing record of using judicial activism to go soft on crime. Today, I need to discuss how these disagreements affect the very bedrock of our republic. For multiple years now, the Democratic Party has waged an aggressive campaign to bully our independent justices and attack the legitimacy of their institution. When the plain text of our laws and Constitution disappoint liberals' policy preferences, they mount radical campaigns to wreck the court itself. This civic cancer began on the fringe, but it's quickly metastasized throughout their party. 3 years ago, sitting Democrats sent the court an absurd amicus brief threatening retribution for a certain ruling. 2 years ago, the Democratic leader rallied with radicals on the court steps and threatened multiple justices by name if they didn't produce the policy result he preferred. Last year, when fringe activists wanted to dig up the discredited concept of partisan court packing, President Biden lent it legitimacy with a presidential commission. Now, just recently, the Senate Democratic whip said that his side's court packing proposals don't matter because they lack 60 votes to pass the Senate. Well, that was cold comfort considering the senator just voted to destroy the 60-vote threshold a few months back. So this nomination has occurred against a strange backdrop. The Senate Democrats who spent weeks fulsomely praising Judge Jackson have spent years attacking her soon-to-be workplace. This is why I needed to hear Judge Jackson denounce court packing. Justices Ginsburg and Breyer had no trouble, none, condemning these schemes loudly as sitting justices. Surely President Biden could find himself an institutionalist in their mold. But alas, Judge Jackson was the court packer's favorite pick for the vacancy, and she refused to follow the Ginsburg-Breyer model. She signaled the opposite. She said she'd be thrilled to be one of however many. The left's escalating war against the judiciary is a symptom of a profound misunderstanding. Judicial activism sees the court as a third legislature. The left wants one policymaking body with 435 members, one with 100, and one that consists of 9 lawyers. Let me say that again. The left wants one policymaking body with 435 members, one with 100, and one that consists of non-lawyers. That isn't what the founders created, and it's not what the American people signed up for. We've seen over and over that when judicial activism triumphs over fidelity to the rule of law, our courts mutate into clumsy proxy battlefields for arguments that belong in this chamber and out in 50 state legislatures. This is unfair to the American people. It damages our institutions, not the least the courts themselves. So there's only one way to lower the temperature, depoliticize the courts, and protect the rule of law, confirming only judges who will honor the Constitution and not supplant it. The road to a healthy court and a healthy country is not striking some balance where some justices stick to the text and some justices try to make policy. The solution is for all the justices to stay in their lane. There's one right number of justices who seek to follow the law. The number is 9. Ginsburg said it. Breyer said it. There's one right number of justices who seek to make policy. 0. There are jurists and scholars with personal views across the political spectrum who understand that all judges should be textualists and constitutionalists in their day jobs, and that must be the Senate standard. I see hallmarks of judicial activism in Judge Jackson's record. Therefore, I will vote no. Nevertheless, our Democratic colleagues are on track to confirm our next Supreme Court justice. And do you know what won't happen? Top Republicans will not imply she's illegitimate. We will not call for court packing. I won't be joining any mobs outside her new workplace and threatening her by name. Democrats must stop their political siege of the institution that Judge Jackson is about to join. They must stop their assault on judicial independence. We're about to have a new justice whose fan club has openly attacked the rule of law. So Judge Jackson will quickly face a fork in the road. One approach to her new job would delight the far left. A different approach would honor the separation of powers and the Constitution. The soon-to-be justice can either satisfy her radical fan club or help preserve the judiciary that Americans need, but not both. I'm afraid the nominee's records tells us which is likely, but I hope Judge Jackson proves me wrong.
Under the previous order, the Senate will resume legislative session and proceed to consideration of H.R. 6968 and H.R. 7108 en bloc, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 312, H.R. 6968, an act to prohibit the importation of energy products of the Russian Federation and for other purposes. Calendar number 313, H.R. 7108, an act to suspend normal trade relations treatment for the Russian Federation and so forth and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, amendment number 5021 to H.R. 6968 and amendment number 5020 to H.R. 7108 are agreed to, and the bills, as amended, are considered and read a third time. The question occurs on the passage of H.R. 7108 as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoban, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Braun, Cantwell, Cardin, Cassidy, Collins, Crapo, Daines, Graham, Hickenlooper, Hyde-Smith, Kane, Kennedy, King, Langford, McConnell, Menendez, Reed, Romney, Rosen, Sass, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of South Carolina, Smith, Thune, Warren, Wyden, and Young. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Miss Stabenow, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye.
Hello there. On this vote, the yeas are 100. The nays are 0. The bill as amended is passed. The question occurs on passage of H.R. 6968 as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker,
Aye.
Mr. Bozeman. Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Sorry, sir. Thank you. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo. Thanks. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Thank you. Senator Lujan. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin. Thank you. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Thanks. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Thanks. Senators voting in the affirmative. Blackburn, Blumenthal, Booker, Bozeman. Burr, Capito, Casey, Coons, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Duckworth, Graham, Hoeven, Inhofe, Johnson, Kelly, King, Leahy, Lujan, Lummis, McConnell, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Paul, Peters, Portman, Rosen, Rubio, Sanders, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Sinema, Stabenow, Tester, Thune. Are you an aye, Senator? Tillis, Toomey, Van Hollen, Warnock, Whitehouse, and Wicker. No senator voted in the negative. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. No what? No. Well. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Thank you. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. You go. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye.